What happened when the school nurse wasn't allowed to give someone their medication? I was standing outside the nurse's office at 11:42 a.m. when I heard Vice Principal Dawson tell Nurse Keating that if she gave my brother his seizure medication one more time without a parent physically present in the building, she'd be terminated immediately. Through the small window in the door, I watched her face go pale as she held the orange prescription bottle in her trembling hand. My brother Cameron was sitting on the examination table behind her, and I could see the way his left eye had started twitching, the warning sign we'd learned to recognize over the past 3 years. He had maybe 15 minutes before a full tonic-clonic seizure hit, and Dawson was standing there with his arms crossed, blocking the medication cabinet like it contained nuclear codes instead of anti-epileptic drugs that kept my 14-year-old brother's brain from short-circuiting. I knocked on the door hard enough to rattle the frame, and when Dawson turned to glare at me, I saw something in his expression that made my blood run cold. He looked satisfied, like he'd been waiting for exactly this moment to prove whatever twisted point he'd been trying to make since he'd arrived at Riverside High 3 months ago. I'd been a junior at Riverside High for 2 years when Vice Principal Gregory Dawson transferred from some private academy in Vermont, bringing with him what he called a philosophy of personal responsibility and parental accountability. He was in his early 50s, always wore the same navy suit with a red tie, and had this way of speaking that made everything sound like a corporate mission statement. The principal, Dr. Eleanor Vance, was nearing retirement and had basically handed Dawson all the day-to-day operational control, which meant he'd spent the past 3 months implementing policy changes that seemed designed to make everyone's life harder. He'd eliminated the free breakfast program because it encouraged dependency, banned students from carrying backpacks between classes because of security concerns, and most recently, instituted a new medication policy requiring parental presence for any prescription drug administration. The policy memo had gone out 2 weeks ago, and most parents had just shrugged and figured their kids could handle their own medications. But Cameron wasn't like most kids. Cameron had been diagnosed with epilepsy 3 years ago after collapsing during a middle school basketball game. The neurologist, Dr. Rashida Kimani, had explained that his seizures were triggered by stress, lack of sleep, and sometimes nothing at all, just his brain's electrical system misfiring without warning. The medication, Keppra, had to be taken at exactly the same times every day to maintain consistent blood levels. Miss that window by more than an hour, and the risk of breakthrough seizures increased exponentially. Cameron's dosing schedule was 7 a.m. noon and 7 p.m. And for the past 3 years, he'd taken his noon dose in the nurse's office at Riverside High, where I could walk him there from my calculus class and make sure he actually swallowed the pills instead of pretending to, because he was embarrassed about his condition. Our mom worked as a paralegal downtown, 40 minutes away with traffic, and our dad had died from cancer when I was 12. There was no way Mom could show up at school every day at noon to watch Cameron take his medication, and we'd explained this in detail when Dawson's policy memo had first circulated. The escalation had started small, like these things always do. The first week after the new policy took effect, Nurse Keating had continued giving Cameron his medication as usual, figuring that common sense would prevail over bureaucratic nonsense. But then Dawson had started showing up at the nurse's office during medication times, clipboard in hand, asking to see parental authorization forms and physically present guardians. Nurse Keating, who'd been at Riverside for 18 years and had seen everything from asthma attacks to anaphylaxis, had tried explaining the medical necessity of consistent dosing schedules. She'd shown him Cameron's neurologist's orders, his individualized education plan, the emergency action protocols Dr. Vance had approved years ago. Dawson had listened with this patronizing smile and said that while he understood her concerns, policies existed for liability reasons and couldn't have exceptions, no matter how compelling the medical situation appeared to be. The second week, Mom had tried taking her lunch break to drive to school for Cameron's noon dose, but her boss had made it clear this wasn't sustainable long-term. She'd called Dr. Vance to complain, but the principal had deferred to Dawson's expertise in policy administration. Mom had contacted our family lawyer, Patricia Montgomery, who'd sent a strongly worded letter citing federal disability laws and 504 plan protections. Dawson's response, delivered through the district's legal counsel, had been that the policy didn't prohibit Cameron from receiving his medication. It simply required parental supervision during administration to ensure proper protocols and prevent medication diversion or abuse. The lawyer had said this was technically legal, but morally bankrupt, and that we could file a complaint with the Office for Civil Rights, though that process could take months. Cameron couldn't wait months. He needed his medication at noon every single day, and we were running out of options. By the third week, Cameron had started showing signs of increased seizure activity. His neurologist had documented 3 minor episodes, brief absence seizures where he'd space out for 30 seconds, staring blankly while his brain essentially rebooted. Dr. Kamani had increased his dosage and sent another letter to the school emphasizing the critical nature of strict medication compliance. That's when I'd Started skipping my calculus class to make sure Cameron got to the nurse's office, and that's when things had gotten really ugly. Dawson had started calling me to his office, saying my attendance in fourth period was concerning, and that my protective behavior toward my brother was enabling his dependence rather than fostering independence. I'd told him that keeping my brother alive wasn't enabling, it was basic human decency. He'd given me 2 days of detention for disrespectful conduct toward administration. Now here we were, week 4, with Cameron sitting in the nurse's office showing clear pre-seizure symptoms, while Dawson physically prevented Nurse Keating from accessing the medication that could stop what was about to happen. I pushed through the door without permission and moved between Dawson and my brother. Cameron's left hand was starting to tremble now, fingers curling and uncurling in that rhythmic pattern that meant we had maybe 10 minutes before full seizure onset. His breathing had changed too, becoming shallow and rapid, and I could see the fear in his eyes because he knew what was coming and knew there was nothing he could do to stop it. Nurse Keating still held the prescription bottle, looking between Dawson and me with this desperate expression that said she wanted to help but was terrified of losing her job. The room smelled like antiseptic and fear, and the clock on the wall read 11:48 a.m., 12 minutes past his scheduled dose time. I pulled out my phone and called Mom, putting it on speaker before Dawson could object. She answered on the second ring, her voice tense because she knew I only called during school hours for emergencies. I explained the situation in quick, clipped sentences. Cameron showing pre-seizure symptoms, medication being withheld, Dawson threatening to fire the nurse. Mom started yelling immediately, demanding to speak to Dawson, demanding the medication be administered, threatening legal action and media exposure and whatever else she could think of in her panic. Dawson listened, with his arms still crossed, and then calmly explained that phone consent wasn't sufficient under the new policy, that physical parental presence was required, and that if Mrs. Keating violated policy despite this clear warning, her employment would be terminated effective immediately. Mom said she was leaving work right now and would be there in 40 minutes with traffic. I looked at Cameron's trembling hands and knew 40 minutes was about 30 minutes too late. Nurse Keating made her decision at 11:51 a.m. I watched her square her shoulders, open the medication bottle, and shake out 2 pills into a small paper cup. She handed it to Cameron along with a cup of water and said in a clear, steady voice that she was administering prescribed medication to a student with a documented medical condition under emergency circumstances, and that Mr. Dawson could file whatever paperwork he wanted after the fact. Cameron took the pills with shaking hands, and I held my breath waiting to see if they'd work fast enough. Dawson's face went bright red, and he pulled out his radio, calling for security to document this incident of policy violation and escort Nurse Keating from the building. His voice was cold and formal, like he was narrating a training video on proper termination procedures rather than destroying someone's career for the crime of keeping a kid from having a seizure. 2 security guards arrived within minutes, Dennis O'Connor and Yolanda Barnes, both of whom had been at Riverside forever and knew Cameron's situation well. They looked uncomfortable as Dawson ordered them to escort Nurse Keating to her car and ensure she removed all personal belongings from the office immediately. Nurse Keating didn't argue or plead. She just asked if she could stay until Cameron's mother arrived to ensure someone medically trained was present in case his symptoms worsened despite the late medication. Dawson said absolutely not, that she was no longer authorized to be on school property, and that Cameron could wait in the main office where administrative staff could monitor him until his mother arrived. The casual cruelty of it, treating my brother's life-threatening condition like it was no more serious than a paperwork error, made something crack inside my chest. I stepped between the guards and Nurse Keating and told them they'd have to physically remove me too if they were going to do this. Dennis looked at Dawson with obvious distaste. "Sir, the kid just took his medication. Maybe we could let the nurse stay until his mom gets here, just to be safe." Dawson's expression went from red to purple. "Are you questioning a direct order?" His voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Because I can have 3 people escorted off campus just as easily as 1. Dennis and Yolanda exchanged glances, and I could see them doing the calculation, their jobs versus doing what was right. I wanted to hate them for choosing their jobs, but I understood. They both had families, mortgages, lives that depended on their paychecks. The system was designed to make compliance the only rational choice, even when compliance meant enabling cruelty. Nurse Keating put her hand on my shoulder and told me it was okay, that I should stay with Cameron while she gathered her things. She looked at Dawson one more time and said quietly that she hoped he could live with himself, then walked out with the security guards flanking her like she was a criminal instead of a healthcare professional who'd just saved a kid from a medical emergency. Cameron and I sat in the nurse's office, now staffed by nobody since Nurse Keating was gone, and the district apparently hadn't planned for that contingency, watching the clock and waiting for Mom to arrive. His trembling had mostly stopped, thank God, which meant the medication was kicking in despite being administered late. But I could see the toll this was taking on him, emotionally. His face was red, not from medical distress, but from embarrassment and anger, and the particular shame that comes from being treated like your health condition is a discipline problem rather than a medical reality. He kept apologizing, saying this was his fault, that maybe he should have just tried to go without the noon dose. I grabbed his shoulders and made him look at me, told him that none of this was his fault, that Dawson was on some power trip and Nurse Keating had been the only adult brave enough to do the right thing. Mom arrived at 12:34 p.m., breathless from running through the parking lot. She hugged Cameron first, checking his hands and eyes for seizure signs, then turned to me with a look of pure maternal fury that would have been terrifying if it wasn't directed at someone who deserved it. She demanded to know where Dawson's office was, and I told her he was probably in the administrative wing documenting Nurse Keating's termination. We walked there together, Cameron between us, and I felt something shift in my understanding of how institutions work. They didn't fail accidentally or through ignorance. They failed because people like Dawson valued policy and control more than human welfare, and because the system rewarded that kind of callousness with job security and promotions while punishing compassion with unemployment. The confrontation in Dawson's office lasted 23 minutes and accomplished nothing except making it clear he had no intention of reversing course. Mom cited federal disability law, threatened lawsuits, invoked Cameron's 504 plan protections, and demanded Nurse Keating's immediate reinstatement. Dawson listened with that same patronizing smile and explained that Nurse Keating had violated a clearly communicated policy after explicit warning, that her termination was effective immediately, and that the district would be advertising for a replacement nurse who understood the importance of following protocols. Mom asked what Cameron was supposed to do for medication administration until they hired someone new. Dawson said Cameron could go to the main office where administrative staff would supervise him taking his medication that he'd self-administer, or Mom could continue taking her lunch break to come to school, or Cameron could transition to homeschooling if the policy was too burdensome for the family. The casual way he framed it, like these were all equally reasonable options, made me want to flip his desk. We left his office and Mom immediately called Patricia Montgomery, our lawyer, from the parking lot. Patricia listened to the situation and her response was blunt. What Dawson had done was probably legal from an employment perspective since schools had broad authority to set medication policies, but it was almost certainly a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. The problem was that proving disability discrimination required documentation, and fighting it through proper legal channels would take months of complaints and hearings. She recommended filing an immediate complaint with the Office for Civil Rights and the State Department of Education, but warned that bureaucratic processes moved slowly, and Cameron needed his medication administered correctly every single day starting tomorrow. She also suggested we consider going to the media, because sometimes public pressure accomplished what legal pressure couldn't. That afternoon, I started documenting everything. I wrote down exact times, quotes from Dawson, descriptions of Cameron's symptoms, and Nurse Keating's attempts to follow proper medical protocol. I dug out the original policy memo Dawson had sent about parental presence requirements and highlighted the section that made no exceptions for documented medical conditions. I found Dr. Kamani's letters emphasizing the critical nature of consistent medication timing and the increased seizure risk from missed or late doses. I pulled up Cameron's 504 plan, which specifically outlined his right to receive necessary medical care during school hours. I created a timeline showing the escalation from policy implementation to Nurse Keating's termination, and I saved everything in multiple locations because I had a feeling this was going to get ugly before it got better. Mom filed the formal complaints that evening, one with the Office for Civil Rights, one with the State Department of Education, and one with the District Superintendent's Office. Each complaint detailed the medication policy's discriminatory impact on students with disabilities, the retaliation against a nurse who'd provided medically necessary care, and the school's failure to provide reasonable accommodations under federal law. Patricia Montgomery helped draft everything in proper legal language, citing specific statutes and regulations. The complaints went out at 8:17 p.m. via certified mail and email, and we all knew that Dawson would receive copies first thing the next morning. We also knew he'd probably respond by doubling down rather than backing off, because men like him didn't admit mistakes, they just found new ways to justify their cruelty. I spent that night researching school medication policies, and found that Riverside's new requirements were unusual, even by strict standards. Most schools allowed nurses to administer prescription medications with parental consent forms on file and physician orders, exactly the system Nurse Keating had been using for years. Requiring physical parental presence for every dose was so impractical, it bordered on prohibitive, especially for working families or students who needed multiple daily doses. I found several legal precedents where courts had ruled that unreasonably restrictive medication policies violated disability protections, and I screenshot everything to send to Patricia. I also found Nurse Keating's phone number in the school directory and called her at 9:43 p.m. to check if she was okay. She answered sounding exhausted and defeated, and I apologized for getting her fired by pushing the situation. She told me not to apologize, that she'd been a nurse for 26 years and had never once regretted putting patient care over bureaucratic compliance. She said Dawson had called her at home to officially document the termination and to remind her that she'd signed a non-disparagement agreement as a condition of employment, which meant she couldn't publicly criticize the school or district without risking legal action. The legal gag was designed to protect institutional reputation over truth, and I could hear in her voice that she felt trapped by it. I asked if she'd be willing to talk to a lawyer about wrongful termination, and she said she'd already contacted the teachers' union about representation. I also asked if she'd be willing to provide a statement for our disability discrimination complaint, and she said absolutely, that somebody needed to stop Dawson before more kids got hurt. The next morning, Cameron and I arrived at school to find a substitute nurse in the office, a young woman named Jenny Alvarado, who looked fresh out of nursing school and nervous as hell. She explained that she'd been hired through a temp agency for emergency coverage until the district could conduct a proper hiring process. She'd been given strict instructions about the medication policy and showed us a printed copy of Dawson's memo highlighting the parental presence requirement. I asked her what she'd do if a student was having a medical emergency and needed medication immediately. She hesitated, looking toward the hallway like she was worried someone was listening, then said quietly that she'd been told to call 911 and let paramedics handle any emergencies rather than risk policy violations. The implication was clear. The district was more worried about liability than about students' health, and they'd hired someone too inexperienced or too scared to push back against unreasonable policies. Cameron's noon medication time approached, and Mom couldn't make it because her boss had given her a written warning about excessive absences after she'd left work the previous day. I walked Cameron to the nurse's office at 11:58 a.m., and we waited to see what would happen. Nurse Alvarado looked at the clock, looked at Cameron's prescription bottle in the locked cabinet, and then looked at me with an expression of pure panic. She called the main office and asked to speak with Mr. Dawson about how to proceed with a student who needed medication, but whose parent wasn't present. While we waited for Dawson to respond, Cameron's eye started twitching again. The pre-seizure warning signs were beginning, despite him having taken his medication yesterday, which Dr. Kamani had warned could happen. Missing even one properly timed dose could take days to recover from in terms of blood level stability. Dawson arrived at 12:04 p.m., 6 minutes past Cameron's dosing window, and I felt my blood pressure spike just seeing his face. He told Nurse Alvarado that the policy was clear and that she should document Cameron's presence and the lack of parental supervision, then send him back to class. I stepped forward and explained that Cameron was showing pre-seizure symptoms, that 6 minutes might not sound like much but could be the difference between stable and seizing, and that his neurologist's orders specifically emphasized the importance of strict timing. Dawson looked at Cameron with clinical detachment and said he didn't see any signs of medical distress, that 6 minutes was a reasonable timeframe variance, and that Cameron could return to class and take his medication during his mother's lunch break tomorrow. The bureaucratic language he used, timeframe variance instead of late medication, medical distress instead of seizure symptoms, was designed to minimize the severity of what was happening. I pulled out my phone and started recording. Dawson immediately told me to put it away, that recording without permission violated school policy. I kept filming and said I was documenting a medical emergency and potential disability discrimination, which was my right under federal whistleblower protections that Patricia Montgomery had explained to me. Dawson's face went red and he grabbed for my phone, but I stepped back and told him that attempting to destroy evidence would only strengthen our legal case. Cameron was between us, visibly shaking now, and Nurse Alvarado looked like she wanted to disappear into the walls. I addressed her directly, on camera, and asked if she'd been instructed to withhold medication from students with documented medical conditions who were showing signs of emergent symptoms. She looked at Dawson, looked at Cameron, and then looked at me with tears in her eyes and nodded. The video captured everything, the timestamp showing we were now 9 minutes past proper dosing time, Cameron's trembling hands, Dawson's angry face, and a nurse admitting she'd been told to let a kid suffer rather than violate policy. That's when Cameron's seizure started. It began with his whole body going rigid, back arching, eyes rolling back in his head. Then the convulsions started, violent, rhythmic shaking that knocked him off the chair he'd been sitting in. He hit the floor hard, head bouncing off the linoleum, and I dropped my phone to turn him on his side like we'd been trained. Nurse Alvarado grabbed a pillow to put under his head while shouting at Dawson to call 911, but he was frozen, just standing there staring like he couldn't believe this was actually happening. I grabbed his radio off his belt and called for emergency services myself, giving our location and explaining we had a student in active tonic-clonic seizure. The school secretary's voice came back shaky and uncertain, saying she'd call 911 immediately. The seizure lasted 2 minutes and 18 seconds according to the timestamp on my dropped phone, which had kept recording from where it had fallen on the floor. Cameron's convulsions gradually slowed and stopped, leaving him unconscious, and breathing in ragged gasps on the nurse's office floor. Nurse Alvarado checked his pulse and airway, talking to him in a soothing voice, even though he couldn't hear her, doing everything right from a medical response perspective. Dawson had backed into the corner, his face pale, no longer looking satisfied or in control, but rattled in a way that suggested he hadn't actually expected consequences for his policy. I knelt next to Cameron and held his hand, waiting for the paramedics and trying not to think about what brain damage might have occurred during those 2 minutes of oxygen deprivation. The ambulance arrived at 12:16 p.m., and 2 paramedics rushed in with their equipment. They assessed Cameron quickly, checking vitals, asking about his medical history, reviewing his medication schedule. When they learned his noon dose hadn't been administered because of a school policy requiring parental presence, the lead paramedic, whose name tag read T. Stevens, looked up at Dawson with open disgust. "You withheld seizure medication from a diagnosed epileptic because his mom couldn't leave work?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Dawson started to explain about liability and policy compliance, but Stevens cut him off. "People die from seizures. You understand that? This kid could have aspirated vomit or hit his head wrong or gone into status epilepticus. Your policy nearly killed him." The words were delivered in that flat, matter-of-fact tone that emergency responders use when they're too professional to scream at someone's stupidity, but want their judgment to land hard. They loaded Cameron onto a stretcher and took him to County General Hospital. I rode in the ambulance while calling Mom from my phone, which I'd retrieved from the nurse's office floor, still recording. Mom met us at the emergency room looking destroyed, her professional paralegal composure completely shattered by the reality of her 14-year-old being wheeled through automatic doors on a gurney. The ER doctor, Dr. Michael Osei, examined Cameron and reviewed his medication history. He kept asking variations of the same question. Why hadn't the noon dose been administered on time? And each time Mom explained about the policy, his expression grew darker. He said Cameron's seizure had been directly caused by inconsistent medication blood levels, that the delayed dose from yesterday had created a gap that today's missed dose had widened into a full breakthrough event, and that this was completely preventable with proper medication management. Dr. Osei ordered labs to check Cameron's drug levels and a CT scan to ensure the head impact during the fall hadn't caused any brain bleeding. While we waited for results, he asked if we wanted him to file a medical report documenting the school's policy as a contributing factor to Cameron's seizure. Mom said yes immediately, and Dr. Osei explained that he was a mandated reporter under state law, which meant he had legal obligations to report situations where institutional policies endangered a child's welfare. He documented everything in Cameron's medical chart, with timestamps and specific details about the medication delay, the pre-seizure symptoms that had been ignored, and the seizure itself. He also noted Dawson's presence during the incident and his refusal to authorize medication administration despite clear medical need. The report would be submitted to Child Protective Services and the State Medical Board, creating official records of what had happened. Cameron woke up around 3:15 p.m., groggy and disoriented the way he always was after seizures. He didn't remember the event itself or the 15 minutes before it started, which Dr. Osei said was normal for this type of seizure. The CT scan came back clear, no bleeding or structural damage, but the lab results showed his medication levels were below therapeutic range, confirming what we already knew. Dr. Osei adjusted his dosing schedule and gave strict instructions about consistent timing, then asked point blank if we had a plan for ensuring he'd receive his medication at school. Mom explained about the complaints we'd filed and the lawyer we'd hired, and Dr. Osei said he'd provide whatever medical documentation we needed to support our case. He also mentioned that he'd treated 3 other students from Riverside High in the past month for preventable medical complications related to the new medication policy, one diabetic student who'd had a hypoglycemic episode after being unable to access emergency glucose, and 2 students with ADHD whose behavior had deteriorated after inconsistent medication administration. That information felt like finding missing puzzle pieces that suddenly made the whole picture clear. This wasn't just about Cameron or Dawson's personal vendetta, it was a systemic problem affecting multiple students with disabilities. I asked Dr. Osei if he'd be willing to testify about the pattern he'd observed, and he said absolutely, that medical professionals had ethical obligations to speak up when institutional policies harmed patients. He gave us copies of Cameron's medical records and his incident report, both crucial evidence for our legal case. Mom called Patricia Montgomery from the hospital and briefed her on the seizure and Dr. Osei's findings. Patricia said this changed everything, that we now had documented medical harm directly caused by the policy, which dramatically strengthened our disability discrimination claim. She said we should file for an emergency injunction to force the school to allow Cameron to receive his medication properly, while the larger legal case proceeded. The emergency injunction hearing was scheduled for Friday morning, less than 48 hours after Cameron's seizure. Patricia worked around the clock to prepare our case, assembling medical records, expert statements from Dr. Kamani and Dr. Osei, the video I'd recorded showing Cameron's pre-seizure symptoms being ignored, and documentation of the policy itself. We also had Nurse Keating's statement describing her termination for providing medically necessary care, and affidavits from the parents of the other students Dr. Osei had mentioned, whose medical conditions had been negatively impacted by the policy. Patricia said the district's lawyers would argue that the policy was necessary for student safety and parental rights, but that our evidence showed it was actually endangering students and violating federal disability protections. Thursday morning, I returned to school for the first time since the seizure. Cameron was still at home recovering, and Dr. Osei had ordered him to stay out for the rest of the week to stabilize his medication levels. The atmosphere at Riverside had changed noticeably. Students who'd been vaguely aware of the medication policy situation were now talking about it openly, sharing stories about friends who couldn't access inhalers or EpiPens or ADHD medication without jumping through impossible hoops. Several parents had started calling the school demanding policy changes. The local news had picked up the story after someone, I suspected Nurse Keating despite her non-disparagement agreement, had tipped off a reporter about the situation. A TV crew was camped outside the school entrance interviewing students and parents, and I recognized the reporter as Denise Calabria from Channel 4, who'd done investigative pieces on school board corruption in the past. Denise stopped me in the parking lot before first period and asked if I'd be willing to give an interview about what had happened to my brother. I told her I needed to check with our lawyer first, and she handed me her card saying she'd wait for my call. I texted Patricia from my car, and she responded immediately saying that media attention could help our case by creating public pressure for policy change, but that I should be careful about what specific claims I made since the case was now in active litigation. She sent me talking points: stick to facts, emphasize the medical evidence, focus on the pattern of students being denied necessary care. I called Denise back and agreed to an interview during lunch period. The interview aired that evening on the 6 p.m. news. Denise had put together a comprehensive segment titled "School Policy Leads to Student Seizure" that included my interview, statements from other parents whose kids had been affected, medical expert commentary about the importance of consistent medication timing, and footage of the school with Dawson's official statement declining to comment on personnel matters or pending litigation. The coverage made Riverside look exactly as bad as they deserved, and by the next morning the story had been picked up by regional news outlets and was trending on local social media. Parents were furious, disability rights advocates were calling for investigations, and the district superintendent's office was reportedly receiving hundreds of angry phone calls demanding Dawson's removal and policy reversal. The emergency injunction hearing on Friday morning took place in family court with Judge Patricia Huang presiding. She was known for being tough but fair, with a particular focus on children's rights and disability protections. The courtroom was packed with parents, teachers, students, and media representatives who'd gotten wind of the case. Patricia Montgomery presented our evidence methodically: medical records documenting Cameron's seizure and the medication delay that caused it, expert testimony from Dr. Kamani and Dr. Osei about the medical necessity of consistent dosing, the video showing Dawson refusing to allow medication administration despite visible pre-seizure symptoms, and documentation of the pattern affecting multiple students. She argued that the policy violated the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 by creating discriminatory barriers to necessary medical care, and that immediate injunctive relief was necessary to prevent further harm to Cameron and other students. The district's attorney, Robert Finch, argued that the policy was a reasonable safety measure designed to prevent medication errors and protect parental rights to oversee their children's medical care. He claimed that requiring parental presence wasn't discriminatory because it applied to all students equally, and that the school couldn't be held liable for medical emergencies that occurred despite their good faith efforts to follow proper protocols. He tried to characterize Cameron's seizure as an unfortunate but unforeseeable event, rather than a direct consequence of the policy. Judge Huang listened to both sides with an increasingly skeptical expression, particularly when Finch tried to argue that 6 minutes of medication delay couldn't be directly linked to a seizure that occurred 13 minutes later. Judge Huang called a brief recess to review the evidence, and when court resumed 20 minutes later, her ruling was swift and unequivocal. She found that the medication policy, as implemented, created an undue burden on students with disabilities who required time-sensitive medication administration, that the burden was neither necessary nor reasonable given standard practices at other schools, and that the policy had directly resulted in documented medical harm to Cameron and potentially other students. She issued an emergency injunction ordering Riverside High to immediately allow qualified medical staff to administer prescription medications to students with documented medical conditions and parental consent on file without requiring physical parental presence. The injunction also required the immediate reinstatement of Nurse Keating or hiring of qualified replacement staff and prohibited any retaliation against families who'd complained about the policy. Violations of the injunction would result in contempt of court charges and daily fines of $5,000. The courtroom erupted in applause, which Judge Huang gavelled down, but didn't seem bothered by. She also ordered the school district to pay our legal fees and costs, noting that families shouldn't have to bear financial burdens to enforce basic disability rights. Patricia looked satisfied in that professional way lawyers have when they've thoroughly demolished the opposition's arguments. Mom was crying with relief, and I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight since watching my brother convulse on a nurse's office floor. We'd won this battle, though the war for broader accountability was still ongoing. The district appealed the injunction immediately, but Judge Huang denied their stay pending appeal, which meant her order went into effect immediately. Nurse Keating was officially reinstated on Monday morning with back pay and a formal apology from the superintendent's office, though notably not from Dawson himself. The medication policy was suspended district-wide pending a comprehensive review by medical experts and disability rights advocates. Cameron returned to school on Monday and took his noon dose in the nurse's office with Nurse Keating administering it, exactly the way it should have been all along. She gave him a hug and told him she was glad he was okay, and I saw tears in her eyes when she said it. But Dawson didn't resign or get fired. He remained vice principal, though his responsibilities were restructured to focus on facilities management rather than student services. The district issued a statement saying they'd identified areas for improvement in policy implementation, but defended Dawson's intentions as being focused on student safety. The corporate language was designed to acknowledge problems without admitting liability, and it made clear that institutional accountability still meant protecting administrators over students. Several parents, including Mom, started attending school board meetings demanding Dawson's removal, but the board consistently deflected, saying personnel decisions were confidential and they had full confidence in their administrative staff. The Office for Civil Rights Investigation proceeded separately from our injunction case. Their investigator, Marcus, I can't use that name. Let me call him Julian Brenner, spent 3 weeks interviewing students, parents, staff, and administrators. He reviewed medical records, policy documents, and the timeline of events leading to Cameron's seizure. His preliminary findings, shared with us in October, indicated multiple violations of disability rights laws, including failure to provide reasonable accommodations, retaliation against medical staff who advocated for students, and discriminatory policy implementation that disproportionately burdened students with disabilities. The full report wouldn't be released until December, but Julian indicated that the district was facing potential federal sanctions, mandatory policy reforms, and requirements for comprehensive disability rights training for all staff. Nurse Keating filed her own lawsuit for wrongful termination and retaliation in September. Her attorney argued that she'd been fired specifically for fulfilling her professional duties as a licensed nurse and for advocating for a student's medical needs, which constituted illegal retaliation under state whistleblower protections. The case attracted support from nursing organizations and unions, who filed amicus briefs arguing that healthcare professionals couldn't be forced to choose between proper patient care and employment. The district tried to settle quietly, but Nurse Keating refused to sign any agreement that included non-disclosure clauses. She wanted what had happened to her to be public record, so other nurses wouldn't face the same impossible choices. The criminal investigation surprised everyone, including our lawyer. In November, the county prosecutor's office announced they were investigating whether Dawson's actions constituted child endangerment under state criminal statutes. The prosecutor, Angela Ruiz, stated publicly that while policy disagreements were normally handled through civil or administrative processes, deliberately withholding necessary medical care from a minor could potentially meet the threshold for criminal charges. She emphasized that they were still investigating and no charges had been filed, but that they took seriously any situation where an adult in a position of authority had endangered a child's welfare. The criminal investigation shifted the entire tone of the situation from administrative dispute to potential criminal matter, and I could tell from the district's responses that they were starting to panic about their legal exposure. Dawson hired a criminal defense attorney in early December as the prosecutor's investigation intensified. Meanwhile, Cameron was thriving. His medication was being administered properly, his seizures were controlled, and he'd made the freshman basketball team despite missing 3 weeks of practice. He told me once that he was glad everything had happened because it had exposed how broken the system was, though he wished it hadn't required him having a seizure on a nurse's office floor to make adults pay attention. The pragmatic acceptance in his voice, 14 years old and already understanding that institutional change often requires documented harm, made me both proud of his resilience and angry about a system that demanded suffering as proof of problems. The Office for Civil Rights released their final report in mid-December. They found that Riverside High School and the district had violated the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act through their implementation of discriminatory medication policies that created barriers to necessary medical care for students with disabilities. The report detailed specific violations including failure to provide reasonable accommodations, retaliation against staff who advocated for disability rights, and inadequate training on disability law compliance. The district was required to implement comprehensive remedial measures including policy revisions, staff training, appointment of a disability rights coordinator, and monitoring to ensure compliance. They were also required to compensate affected families for documented harm, though the exact amounts would be negotiated separately. Dawson was quietly transferred to a district-level administrative position in January, removed from direct contact with students, but still employed. The transfer was presented as a promotion, though everyone understood it was actually a way to remove him from Riverside without admitting culpability. He was replaced as vice principal by Mrs. Linda Chen. Wait, I can't use Chen. Let me call her Mrs. Linda Fontaine, an experienced administrator known for her focus on student welfare and collaborative leadership. She met with Mom and me during her first week and apologized directly for what we'd endured, promising that student health would always take priority over bureaucratic compliance under her administration. She also reinstated my calculus class attendance without penalty and removed the detention citations Dawson had given me for disrespectful conduct. The county prosecutor decided not to file criminal charges against Dawson in February, citing insufficient evidence to prove criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt. Angela Ruiz explained that while Dawson's actions had been reckless and harmful, criminal child endangerment required proving he'd intended to cause harm rather than simply being negligent or misguided in his policy implementation. The decision was disappointing, but not surprising. Criminal justice systems set high bars for prosecution, and Dawson had maintained throughout that he'd been trying to protect students and ensure proper protocols rather than deliberately endangering anyone. Mom asked if we could appeal the decision, but Patricia explained that prosecutorial discretion was nearly absolute, and appeals of non-prosecution decisions rarely succeeded. But Nurse Keating's civil case went to trial in April, and that's where everything finally came together. The trial lasted 5 days, and included testimony from her, from me, from other nurses about professional standards of care, and from disability rights experts about reasonable accommodations. The jury heard about Dawson's threats to fire her if she administered Cameron's medication, about her choice to prioritize patient welfare over employment security, about the termination that had happened immediately after. Dawson testified in his own defense and came across as arrogant and dismissive, repeatedly insisting he'd been following proper policy even when confronted with evidence that his policy had caused medical harm. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding in Nurse Keating's favor on all counts: wrongful termination, retaliation, and violation of public policy protecting healthcare professionals who provide necessary medical care. The damages award was substantial: $180,000 in lost wages and benefits, $250,000 in emotional distress damages, and $500,000 in punitive damages designed to punish the district's egregious conduct and deter future retaliation against healthcare workers. The judge also ordered reinstatement of full seniority and benefits, public acknowledgement of wrongful termination, and removal of any negative references from her employment record. Nurse Keating stood in the courtroom listening to the verdict with tears streaming down her face, and afterward she told reporters that she hoped the outcome would encourage other healthcare professionals to stand up for patients even when institutions pressured them to prioritize policies over care. The verdict made national news in healthcare and education circles, cited as an important precedent for protecting medical professionals' ethical obligations. The district appealed, of course, but they also approached Nurse Keating about a settlement that would increase the damages in exchange for avoiding years of appellate litigation. She agreed to a settlement of just over $1 million total in June, with provisions requiring the district to implement mandatory training on disability rights and medical emergency protocols for all administrators, and to establish an independent medical advisory committee that would review any proposed medication policies before implementation. The settlement was structured to create systemic change rather than just compensating individual harm, which Nurse Keating said was what she'd wanted all along. Cameron graduated 8th grade that June and was heading to high school in the fall, Riverside High, actually, where he'd walk through doors that now had updated emergency protocols and revised medication policies. He was healthy, his seizures were controlled, and he'd become something of a minor celebrity among younger students for being that kid whose case changed the school rules. He handled the attention with bemused grace, more interested in basketball and video games than in his role as an accidental civil rights plaintiff. Mom framed Judge Huang's injunction order and hung it in our living room, a reminder that sometimes fighting institutions is both necessary and possible. I graduated high school the following year and headed to college planning to study health policy and disability rights law. What happened to Cameron had changed my understanding of how systems work and how they fail, and I wanted to spend my career identifying and fixing the structural problems that let people like Dawson endanger kids while hiding behind policies and bureaucratic language. Nurse Keating became a speaker and consultant on healthcare ethics and institutional courage, traveling to schools and hospitals to talk about the importance of prioritizing patient welfare over administrative compliance. She and our family stayed in touch, bonded by shared trauma and shared victory. The lawsuit settlements, the Office for Civil Rights findings, and the publicity around the case created ripple effects throughout the school district and beyond. Other schools reviewed their medication policies and made changes to ensure accessibility for students with disabilities. The state legislature introduced a bill requiring all school districts to implement minimum standards for medication administration and prohibiting policies that created unreasonable barriers to necessary care. The bill passed unanimously and was named Cameron's Law, despite his embarrassed protests that laws shouldn't be named after awkward teenagers who'd rather be anonymous. Dawson left the school district entirely in August, taking a position at an educational consulting firm where he apparently trained administrators on policy implementation and risk management. The irony of him teaching others about risk management after his policies had nearly killed my brother wasn't lost on anyone, but he was someone else's problem now. We heard later that his employment at the consulting firm had been terminated after 6 months when clients became uncomfortable with his association to the Riverside case, though that information came through unofficial channels and we never confirmed it directly. 5 years later, Cameron's in college studying neuroscience because he wants to understand the brain that had nearly killed him and maybe help other people with epilepsy manage their conditions. He still takes his medication at the same times every day, still carries emergency protocols in his wallet, still gets nervous when he has to explain his condition to new people. But he's alive and thriving, and that's everything. He told me once that he sometimes thinks about that day in the nurse's office, about how close it had been, about how different things might have been if Nurse Keating hadn't been brave enough to defy Dawson, or if I hadn't recorded what happened, or if we hadn't fought through the legal system for accountability. I told him I thought about it too, about how many ways the system had tried to fail him and how hard we'd had to fight to make it work the way it was supposed to. Looking back, what strikes me most isn't the injustice of what happened. Institutions fail vulnerable people constantly, and power protects itself reflexively. What strikes me is how many people had to fight how hard just to secure the basic right for a kid to take his medication at school without his parent having to leave work. How a nurse had to risk and lose her job to provide medically necessary care. How we'd had to sue and appeal and go to the media and endure months of bureaucratic battles just to force the system to stop actively endangering students with disabilities. The fact that we won felt less like justice and more like exhausting proof that institutional change requires documented harm, public pressure, legal intervention, and sustained advocacy, even for changes that should have been obvious and immediate. But we did win. Cameron's safe. Nurse Keating got vindicated. The policies changed. Other kids with medical conditions can now access their medications without impossible barriers. Sometimes that has to be enough, knowing you fought and won and changed things for people who come after you, even though you shouldn't have had to fight in the first place. Dawson said no one would believe that a straightforward policy about parental rights could be disability discrimination. Now everyone does. That's justice, incomplete and imperfect, and arriving slower than it should, but justice nonetheless.